The year is 1324. In London, human waste flows through the streets. Disease ravages European cities where most people will never learn to read. Kings live in cold stone castles, their greatest scholars debating how many angels can dance on a pin. But 7,000 miles away, an African king is about to break the global economy with his unimaginable wealth. While European cities wallowed in filth and darkness, African engineers were building universities that taught surgery, astronomers were mapping the stars with precision, and architects were constructing monuments that still baffle modern scientists. The truth they never taught in school will shatter everything believed about civilization. If ready to uncover the hidden history they don't want known, stay watching, because what's about to be discovered will change how the world is seen forever. For centuries, a carefully constructed lie has been told. Textbooks painted Africa as the dark continent, a place without history, without achievement, without civilization. Generations grew up believing that meaningful human progress began in Europe, that enlightenment was a European gift to the world. But this narrative wasn't truth. It was theft. The greatest heist in human history wasn't gold or diamonds. It was the systematic erasure of an entire continent's legacy, the deliberate burial of achievements so magnificent that acknowledging them would have shattered the justifications for colonization. The truth that was hidden is staggering. While Europe struggled through its dark ages, African civilizations were thriving in ways that would seem impossible even by modern standards. This is the story they never wanted told. Long before Rome became an empire, the Kingdom of Kush stood as a superpower of the ancient world. In what is now Sudan, Nubian kings built more pyramids than Egypt, over 250 of them, standing as monuments to African engineering genius. But the pyramids were just the beginning. Kushite metallurgists mastered ironworking techniques that gave them military superiority across the region. Their archers were so feared that ancient texts called them the archers of the world. They developed agricultural systems that sustained massive cities in challenging climates. Then came the moment that shattered European assumptions about African history. In 727 BCE, Kushite King Paye didn't just defend against Egyptian aggression, he conquered Egypt itself. An African kingdom from the south became the rulers of one of history's greatest civilizations. For nearly a century, Nubian pharaohs ruled Egypt, bringing renaissance and restoration. They didn't destroy, they built. They renovated temples, reinvigorated culture, and expanded knowledge. Yet this triumph, this reversal of everything taught about power flowing from north to south, was quietly omitted from most history books. The narrative couldn't allow Africans to be the conquerors, the civilizers, the advanced empire. So the 25th dynasty became a footnote, a curiosity, rather than what it truly was, proof that African kingdoms were shaping the ancient world. Centuries later, in the heart of southern Africa, something impossible was rising. Between the 11th and 15th centuries, the people of Great Zimbabwe were constructing a city that would challenge everything colonizers believed about African capability. Massive stone walls, some 30 feet high, were built without mortar, each granite block cut and placed with such precision that not even a knife blade could slip between them. The great enclosure's walls stretched over 800 feet in circumference, constructed from approximately 1 million granite blocks. The craftsmanship was so sophisticated that it demonstrated advanced knowledge of engineering, mathematics, and architecture. When European colonizers first encountered Great Zimbabwe in the late 19th century, they faced a crisis of ideology. Here stood undeniable proof of African architectural genius, of a civilization that built monuments rivaling anything in medieval Europe. The response wasn't celebration of human achievement, it was denial. Archaeologists were pressured, some even lost their positions, for suggesting that indigenous Africans built these structures. Wild theories were invented. Perhaps it was Phoenicians or Arabs, or even the mythical Queen of Sheba, anyone but Africans. The evidence was overwhelming. The artifacts, the continuous cultural connection, the building techniques matching local traditions. But the lie had to be maintained. If Africans could build this, what else had they achieved? What else had been hidden? The conflict between truth and narrative reached its peak when one archaeologist, James Theodore Bent, was sent specifically to prove Great Zimbabwe wasn't built by Africans. Instead, his findings confirmed an indigenous construction. The evidence was buried, his conclusions dismissed. For decades, the truth was suppressed because acknowledging it would dismantle the fundamental justification for colonization. How could Europeans claim to be bringing civilization to people who had already built civilizations more sophisticated than their own? But perhaps no story better illustrates Africa's hidden magnificence than that of Mansa Musa and the Mali Empire. In the 14th century, while European kingdoms squabbled over modest territories, the Mali Empire controlled an area larger than Western Europe. Its capital, Timbuktu, wasn't just a city, it was the intellectual center of the world. The Sankore University housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, with student enrollment reaching 25,000 at its peak. In the same era, the University of Oxford had perhaps 60 students. Timbuktu's libraries contained texts on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and law. African scholars were performing cataract surgeries and documenting astronomical phenomena, while European physicians still believed in balancing humors. The city's streets bustled with international trade, its markets filled with goods from across 3 continents. Gold flowed so abundantly from West African mines that it became the foundation of Mediterranean and Middle Eastern economies. Then, in 1324, Mansa Musa decided to make his pilgrimage to Mecca. What followed became legendary. The emperor traveled with a caravan of 60,000 people. 500 slaves each carried a golden staff. 80 camels each bore 300 pounds of gold. This wasn't a king trying to impress. This was simply how the richest man in human history traveled. Modern economists estimate his wealth at $400 billion. But this number is almost meaningless because he possessed a significant percentage of the world's gold supply. When Mansa Musa passed through Cairo, he spent and gave away so much gold that he crashed the Egyptian economy. The value of gold plummeted and wouldn't recover for over a decade. One man's generosity destabilized an entire region's monetary system. On his return journey, realizing what he'd done, he had to borrow gold at high interest rates to help stabilize prices. Even his attempt to fix the problem demonstrated wealth beyond measure. He could borrow enough gold to impact a national economy. Yet this story, this demonstration of African wealth and power that exceeded anything Europe possessed, was relegated to curious anecdotes rather than taught as the pivotal moment it represented. One African emperor had more wealth than all European kingdoms combined. The implications were too dangerous to the colonial narrative. In East Africa, the Kingdom of Axum was controlling international trade routes before most European kingdoms existed. From the 1st to the 8th century CE, Axumite civilization thrived as a major naval and trading power. They minted their own currency, a clear sign of economic sophistication and international recognition. Only the most advanced civilizations controlled their own coinage, and Axum's coins have been found from India to the Mediterranean. The Axumites engineered remarkable agricultural terracing systems that are still used today, developed their own written script, and erected towering stone obelisks, including one weighing over 500 tons. They were among the first nations to officially adopt Christianity, doing so before Rome. Yet history lessons focus on the Roman Empire, while Axum, equally powerful and sophisticated, remains largely unknown. The pattern becomes clear. African achievement was systematically erased from the narrative. Perhaps nowhere is this erasure more visible than in the deliberate destruction of Benin City. In the 15th to 19th centuries, the Benin Kingdom in present-day Nigeria was a marvel of urban planning and engineering. The city was protected by walls and moats that stretched over 10,000 miles, 4 times longer than the Great Wall of China. These weren't crude fortifications, but sophisticated earthworks requiring advanced engineering knowledge, massive labor organization, and central planning that rivaled anything built in medieval Europe. Inside these walls, Benin City was organized with wide, straight boulevards. Here's what made it extraordinary. The city had street lighting in the 13th century. Let that sink in. African engineers were illuminating streets with oil lamps on poles, while European cities remained dark until the 17th century. The streets were clean, the houses well-ordered, the government sophisticated. The Benin bronzes, metal castings of extraordinary artistic and technical quality, demonstrated metallurgical skills that Europeans couldn't replicate even centuries later. When Portuguese explorers first arrived in the 15th century, they wrote in amazement, Their own accounts describe a city larger and better organized than Lisbon. The royal palace complex was compared favorably to European palaces. One Dutch visitor in 1602 wrote that the king's court was magnificent, the nobles well-dressed and dignified, the city prosperous and orderly. Then came 1897. British forces invaded and discovered something that contradicted everything they'd told themselves about Africa. Here was a sophisticated civilization that challenged the fundamental justification for colonization. The British response was systematic destruction. They burned the city, looted thousands of bronze plaques and ivory works, and scattered Benin's artistic heritage across European museums. But more than artifacts were stolen. The evidence of African sophistication was deliberately destroyed. The bronzes ended up in British museums, where for decades they were mislabeled or their origin obscured. The magnificent walls were left to crumble. The city that had been more advanced than European capitals was reduced to a cautionary tale, its destruction justified by invented narratives of savagery. Even ancient Egypt, perhaps history's most studied civilization, has been subjected to this erasure. For centuries, European scholars engaged in intellectual gymnastics to separate Egypt from Africa, to classify it as Middle Eastern or Mediterranean, anything but African. Yet the evidence has always been overwhelming. Ancient Egyptians themselves left records describing their southern origins. Greek historians who actually visited Egypt described Egyptians as dark-skinned people with woolly hair. Modern genetic studies of mummies confirm indigenous African ancestry. Ancient Nubians and Egyptians were biologically and culturally connected. The Sphinx's nose wasn't destroyed by time or Napoleon's cannons, as myths suggest. Evidence points to deliberate defacement, possibly to obscure its African features. This matters because it represents a systematic attempt to divorce one of history's greatest civilizations from its African identity. If Egypt could be mentally relocated from Africa, then Europeans could claim the continent had no significant ancient civilizations. The lie required separating Egypt from its context, treating it as an aberration rather than part of Africa's broader legacy of achievement. But the achievements went beyond monuments. Africa gave the world innovations that became foundations of global civilization. Ancient African divination systems used binary mathematical concepts that mirror modern computing. The Ashango bone from the Democratic Republic of Congo, over 20,000 years old, shows sophisticated mathematical understanding predating similar European artifacts by millennia. African metallurgists developed steel-making techniques in Tanzania that wouldn't appear in Europe for centuries. Agricultural innovations from African civilizations, crop rotation, irrigation systems, terracing, spread globally and sustained populations across continents. Medical knowledge in places like Timbuktu was remarkably advanced. Caesarean sections were being performed successfully in East Africa, while European medicine still relied on bloodletting. Botanical medicine, carefully documented in African texts, treated diseases that European physicians couldn't diagnose. When Europeans finally encountered these practices, they often adopted them while crediting the innovations to their own ingenuity. The so-called European Renaissance borrowed extensively from African and Islamic sources that had preserved and expanded upon classical knowledge. When European scholars rediscovered Greek and Roman texts, many came through African and Middle Eastern libraries. Mathematical concepts, astronomical observations, medical techniques, the rebirth of European learning was fed by knowledge that had never died in Africa and the Islamic world. Yet the narrative presents the Renaissance as a purely European phenomenon, disconnected from the African and Arab scholars who made it possible. Then came the systematic destruction. Colonization wasn't just political and economic, it was epistemological. Libraries were burned, not accidentally but deliberately. In Timbuktu alone, hundreds of thousands of manuscripts were destroyed or scattered. Oral histories were dismissed as primitive mythology. Knowledge keepers were killed or enslaved, their expertise lost. Monuments were defaced, artifacts looted, cities razed. This wasn't collateral damage of conquest, it was calculated erasure. The rewriting of history was equally systematic. Textbooks were written that portrayed Africa as savage and backward, that positioned colonization as a civilizing mission. Generations of students learned a false history because the truth would have delegitimized the entire colonial project. How could Europeans justify enslaving and colonizing people who had built empires more sophisticated than their own? The answer was to hide that those empires had ever existed. But here's where the karma of history reveals itself. Truth has a way of emerging despite suppression. Modern archaeology continues to uncover evidence of African achievement. Satellite imaging reveals city complexes hidden by jungle, far more extensive than previously imagined. Carbon dating proves that structures are thousands of years older than colonizers claimed. DNA analysis confirms what was always evident: the biological continuity of African peoples with their ancient civilizations. Ground-penetrating radar discovers tombs and structures that rewrite timelines. Each technological advancement in archaeology uncovers more evidence of what was hidden. African scholars are reclaiming their heritage, researching with new tools and without colonial assumptions. Museums are being pressured to return looted artifacts. The Benin bronzes are slowly being repatriated. Manuscripts hidden in Timbuktu's private libraries are being digitized and studied. The truth is spreading through channels that didn't exist when the lies were established. Social media, documentaries, academic research from diverse perspectives. Information flows in ways that can't be controlled as they once were. The irony is profound. Every attempt to bury African achievement has ultimately failed. The monuments still stand. The genetic evidence can't be erased. The manuscripts, though scattered, still exist. The very violence of the suppression, the need to destroy so much, to work so hard to hide the truth, has become evidence itself. Why burn the libraries of Timbuktu if they contain nothing of value? Why loot Benin's bronzes if they weren't extraordinary? Why deface the Sphinx if its features didn't challenge the preferred narrative? What this means for understanding human civilization is revolutionary. The story of human progress isn't a European story that spread outward. It's a global story in which Africa played a central, often leading role. The sophisticated urban planning, the mathematical innovations, the medical knowledge, the artistic achievement. These weren't gifts from one people to another, but the collective inheritance of human ingenuity expressed across cultures. The crime wasn't just colonization, devastating as that was. The deeper crime was historical erasure, the theft of heritage, the robbery of pride and knowledge from billions of people. It was telling African children that their ancestors built nothing while standing in the shadow of Great Zimbabwe. It was teaching that civilization began in Greece while ignoring that Greek scholars studied in Egypt. It was claiming that the Enlightenment was purely European while burning the libraries that held Africa's contribution to human knowledge. Why does knowing this truth matter today? Because understanding real history challenges every assumption about race, capability, and human potential. It demolishes the intellectual foundations of racism, which required believing that some peoples were inherently more capable than others. It reveals that what separated civilizations wasn't biology, but geography, resources, and historical circumstance, factors that shifted throughout history, creating different centers of power and innovation at different times. This knowledge is empowering. It shows that human achievement is universal, that brilliance and ingenuity appear wherever humans exist. It demonstrates that the current global power structure isn't natural or inevitable, but the result of specific historical events, many of them recent and some of them reversible. It proves that civilizations rise and fall, that today's powerful were often yesterday's struggling, and vice versa. If this history is shocking, if it creates anger at what was taught, if it inspires questions about what else has been hidden, that reaction is justified. This isn't fringe theory or speculation. This is documented, evidenced, provable history that was deliberately excluded from mainstream education. Don't let this knowledge end here. Share this widely, discuss it, question other narratives accepted without examination. The truth about Africa's achievements has been suppressed for centuries, but it's emerging now, unstoppable and undeniable. Drop a comment about which African empire was most surprising. The truth is out, and there's no putting it back. History always reveals itself, and this revelation is just beginning.